Foreign Affairs Committee is holding the second of two sessions today on the work of the Commonwealth and Development Office. This afternoon we are joined by the Foreign Secretary, and delighted to be so, and for the second time today, Sir Ollie Robbins, the Permanent Under-Secretary. Thank you very much for joining us today. I think that I ought to begin really with a sort of general question, I think, in the light of funding constraints, and that's really this. From what we understand, the admin budget of the Foreign Office is going to be, leaving aside ODA, which everybody knows about, the Overseas Development Budget being cut, and that being obviously a big part of the Foreign Office budget. But there's also going to be 17% cuts to the administrative budget, which Sir Ollie told us this morning is going to result in a 15 to 25% cut in staff. And I think the question that I want to ask you really is the same one that I asked him, which is, why does the Foreign Office have to have the biggest cuts of all the different government departments, given that we are wrestling with so many issues, you know, whether it's Iran or chaos in the Middle East generally, or Donald Trump, or war in Ukraine, when Britain is back on the international stage and trying to be a force for good? Why are we doing this to ourselves? Why are we cutting the Foreign Office by 15 to 25%?
I think we should step back, for starters. The Foreign Office and the over 17,000 footprint across the world, when I came to you last, I was very clear that it was at a low ebb. It was a department that some might describe as bloated as a result of the merger between DFID and the old Foreign Office, Brexit issues, so that needed a clear take. We made a decision, as you know, the Prime Minister made a decision around defence spending, which had an effect on our development budget, which is the lion's share, in fact, of the cut that you were talking about. Actually, in terms of foreign policy, we have done well with the Treasury to get transformation fund for the staff changes that I saw the PermSec discussed with the Select Committee this morning. I'm actually very comfortable that it is important that our middle-ranking staff across the globe have places to go in the organisation. And we have had promotion freezes across the Foreign Office, which I would like to see over this next financial year come to an end. The PermSec explained we have had a lot of Director Generals, we have had a lot of directors across that footprint, and my judgment is that there are too many in the organisation.
That doesn't account for 15 to 25%.
Let me come to the second part, and then the second part of that is about capability. And the truth is that there are innovations like AI where we want to free up better paid, better capable diplomats to make those fine judgments, and therefore I'm comfortable with the cut that we have to make. And I might say also that in terms of the development cut, it has always been the case when you think about our foreign policy, you have hard power, you have soft power and the soft power family, including development, and you have diplomacy. Over the course of the last 50 years, if you see that as an accordion, it's gone up and down across the defence and to foreign and development. I think where we've landed is about right for the times that we're in.
But you just said, I think, and it might be just a slip, but the ODA budget is the ODA budget. It's not this admin budget. The admin budget is separate, isn't it?
Well, within that, I said to the committee when I was last in front of you that I did think that we would have to go into a change programme. We are now in that programme, and therefore, yes, we will be losing staff as a result of that. But yes, in terms of the spending review, our development budget was cut, but actually we had transformation funds within the old Foreign Office, which is the change that we're making. So I'm comfortable broadly with the settlement that we received.
And with the use of AI, how many staff do you think that's going to be able to free up? We're talking about how you're going to get to 15 to 25% cuts in staff, and I just don't think with respect, that AI is going to be it. There must be more than that. You will be losing people.
It's not the sole change that we're making.
Yeah.
What I've also said is that we will, over this period, be losing some of our more senior staff.
More senior people.
Those senior staff are generally paid more. Some of that exit will free up people, and certainly middle-ranking staff, for promotion and to do things. And we are having an intensive look at our capability. So, for example, we are the delivery arm of the government on growth. We need business, economic capability, and we have to have the staff with the appropriate skills. The Foreign Office cannot solely be about geographic expertise. In order to deliver on behalf of the British people and to be focused on our national interests, we have to be conscious of the capabilities we need and also how technology can help us. And let me just, on the AI point, you will recognise that I'm also responsible for SIS and GCHQ. I do find it slightly bizarre that one arm of the building, GCHQ, has intense capability on AI, and the Foreign Office largely has very little, and I want that to change.
But I just don't think that the cutting some senior people and the people you might lose through more extensive use of AI is gonna result in 15% less money being spent on your admin budget, let alone 25%. And there must be other people who will be losing their jobs, and I presume that you know that.
Well, as you know, I set out 6 priorities that should run through the department. So this is a period where I've tasked the PermSec and his senior management team to be focused on the areas that we might no longer be doing. And clearly in the area of development, we are having to make some tough decisions. I'm really keen that we're much more coordinated with the G7 and European allies who fund development. We haven't all got to duplicate. And so there will be, across the organisation, yes, areas where we are not as present as we have been today or as we were 5 years ago.
I think the other thing that you've announced recently, which I think has caused us all a certain amount of confusion, is the China audit, and obviously from what we understand of it, which obviously is not much because we've not been told much, but one thing that we have been told is that there's going to be 1,000 Mandarins speaking Mandarin, and that the Foreign Office is going to be leading on the China strategy, and that the Foreign Office will be where the information comes from, where assistance will be in the end directed. So, I mean, how many, given that you're going to be reducing your staff by 15 to 25%, what percentage of Foreign Office staff do you think in 2 years' time are going to be China specialists?
I think we've got to step back in the context of that question. The first thing is, has Britain had a stable policy towards China over the last 10 to 15 years? I think it'd be hard to find an expert or a journalist or indeed a member of any political party who would say yes. We've jumped around under the last government. We were absolutely committed to setting a course, hence the audit. The audit of right across government that understandably led and coordinated from the Foreign Office, because the Foreign Office had most of the capability, but working with other colleagues like the Cabinet Office and others, and the national security architecture that we've got to fully understand our needs and capabilities. I set out that audit in Parliament. It's underpinned by several reviews, including the National Security Review, the Defence Review, of course, and the Industrial Review and strategies. 3 strategies, all of which, of course, China runs across all of that. What I said to the House of Commons was that I do think we need more capability in the China area, and some of that, of course, is the requirement to be able to speak Mandarin at the various levels. And of course, there are, I think, around 70 or 80 people in the organisation who are extremely proficient in Mandarin. I'd like to see that number grow. But across Whitehall, not all of the capability will be in the FCDO. I do want to see that number increase. If you are in our embassy in China, you will know, Chair, that it's not just made up of Foreign Office staff. There are DBT staff, there are health staff from the Department of Health, there are staff from the Department of Education, because this is a full spectrum operation in the second major superpower in the world. But what I have said is that we need to be better at China capability. We do need more Mandarin speakers, and I've tasked the department with having more Mandarin speakers, also having a fast stream actually cohort that are dedicated to China, because that is the capability I think we need, and that was one of the themes that came out of the audit.
I think we're going to come back to the fast stream, but I just in these sort of just general questions to begin with, can I just start? So do you tell me that at the moment we've got 70 to 80 people in the Foreign Office who speak Mandarin?
No, I think at the highest proficiency.
Right.
But with a department of linguists, there are obviously different levels of proficiency across the organisation.
But your phrase, which was so memorable, 1,000 Mandarin speaking Mandarin, is something that we can remember. I can remember. So I want to know where they're going to be. Are we going to how many more are we going to? I mean, I asked this one. Let me just ask again. So how many do we think we're going to get in the Foreign Office speaking Mandarin in 2 years' time?
The figure represents a figure, I think, across Whitehall.
Yes,
some of that capability is in the agencies.
Yes.
I'd have to take advice, but I'm happy to write to you.
I think it would be good just to have an idea, just given how little we do know about the China audit or the China strategy, as much as we can.
I defer to the Perm Sec, whose responsibility in the end is for is for staffing.
Okay. Can I then just move on, if you don't mind, to Palestine? So I'm sure that have you been briefed on what Israel Katz has said in the last 24 hours? His latest is that he's reportedly ordered Israel's military to prepare for establishing a camp, which he's called a humanitarian city, on the ruins of Rafah. In briefing to Israeli journalists, he said that Palestinians would have to go through security screening before entering, and once inside, they wouldn't be allowed to leave. Israel forces would control the perimeter and move 600,000 Palestinians into the camp. I understand that this is an emigration plan, that it would be seen as a humanitarian transit area. I just wondered if you had been briefed on that and what British reaction was to it.
Well, what we're seized on at the moment is getting a ceasefire.
Yes.
I'd like to sort of brief the committee on the sticking points within getting that ceasefire. I think the committee...
We'd be very interested to hear that, thank you.
The committee will recognise that we are closer than we've been at some time for a ceasefire, but we're clearly not yet there. First is, I want the ceasefire to be permanent. I do not want a pause of 60 days. I want it to be permanent. I know between our Qatari and American counterparts in discussion with Israel and obviously Hamas, there is still a discussion about how permanent that ceasefire will be. That's the first thing.
May I just interject? I mean, the last time we saw you, we seem to have been in exactly the same position then, if you remember. I think we were still in a war at that point, hoping there was going to be a ceasefire. There was one for a time, and now we're back again.
Hence, I'd like it to be a permanent
exactly.
ceasefire.
No, I understand. Yeah.
The second point you make is about the IDF and their location out width of Gaza or in a buffer zone. And I suspect the statement from Defence Minister Katz is in relation to that. And I suspect if indeed he is insistent of that position, then it would be very hard to see how we get that ceasefire, because there is an acute discussion about the degree to which the IDF withdraws from Gaza. The third, of course, is aid, and I imagine that the committee are as concerned as I am for months at the new aid architecture that has been set up. that is entirely unacceptable, that is not delivering to people. People are dying, in fact, waiting for the aid. I think I described it as an abomination. You saw the United Kingdom coordinate with 26 other countries our horrors at the current aid programme. I spoke to Tom Fletcher earlier on this week. Clearly there's got to be a role for the UN and UN agencies if we are to get the aid issues sorted out. So that is the other issue that is before us. And then the fourth issue, of course, relates to hostages. I think there's 56 hostages still there. Sadly, many of them are no longer with us. About 20 are likely to be alive, and there's some discussion about how you coordinate that. Do you get 10 exit on the first phase? I hope the hostage situation can be achieved and dealt with Hamas. But I think that the statements that you've just described from Defence Minister Scott relate very much to where the IDF are located, and you'll understand that if what you describe is true, then I think that would be a big sticking point for getting that ceasefire.
Yeah, and I'm just quoting from Haaretz. I don't know. Yeah. You know, can I move on to the issue of recognition of Palestine? So the government has repeatedly said that it will recognise Palestine at an appropriate time during the process of moving towards a two-state solution. Now, I know that today it seems like a two-state solution is a million miles away, and I appreciate that. But I think that there are increasing numbers of people who are concerned that if we continue to hold back on the recognition of Palestine, there won't be anything left to recognise. And that given what's going on the West Bank, given what's happening in Gaza, that there won't be a Palestinian state, and we'll have missed an opportunity to make it as clear as can be that we think that the long-term solution and the long-term peace of this area can only happen if there's two states. And we should recognise a Palestinian state and then work towards ensuring that one happens practically. But if we continue to hold back, it'll slide through our fingers.
Well, again, I think probably it's best just to step back a bit to say that the United Kingdom has been clear, it's a cross-party position, that we believe that there have to be two states. That position has been maintained for well over a generation.
And I was part of the vote that voted for recognition of Palestine, and it was always clear that we would recognise Palestine at an appropriate time. So that's also a two-party
And as you state, recognition is also something that we remain completely committed to. The debate and the discussion, and I think the language that in the manifesto that we signed up to is recognition as part of a process.
Yes.
Because as a member of the UN Security Council, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, we want that recognition to actually lead to those two states. Yes. Now, there is a debate, I recognise this, and there will be some on this committee that actually believe, as a result of the expansion that we have seen, more expansion in the West Bank in the last year than we saw in the 15 preceding it. More violence than we've seen, that the viability of two states is being put in question by those who are determined to pursue this, and indeed the commitment to two states in parts of the Israeli government give the impression that actually what's being committed to is either one state or no state. I do recognise that. But the truth is that despite some countries recently deciding to recognise, European partners deciding to recognise, it hasn't led to change on the ground. So the debate that is currently being had, and France and Saudi Arabia, of course, were going to have their conference. It's been delayed. There's some discussion about whether it will be re-upped in July or re-upped in September. I don't think that has been settled. I had a conversation with my French counterpart yesterday, and it had not quite been settled. But I will speak to him again later on today because we're the French, because they're here at the state visit. But the debate was about how can this tangibly lead to change on the ground, and of course the UK will play its part, and we are in close discussion with the French and international colleagues about this.
Let me put it this way. Over 100 years ago, the French and the British signed up to Sykes-Picot. It's carved up the Middle East. We are at a stage where the Israelis are about to grab enough of Palestine for Palestine not to exist anymore. And so whilst I appreciate that you're saying it ought to be part of the process, should it not be seen as the beginning of the process? That the two parties to Sykes-Picot, France and Britain, recognise Palestine at that point at the Saudi conference in New York when it's reinstated, and that we then start a process and we play our part in trying to ensure that Trump gets his peace prize with us organising a settlement of the Middle East that everyone in the region can cope with, and pressure is exerted on the Israelis by Trump, so that we do finally get a peace in the Middle East.
I hope it's part of that peace, and I would recognise that I hope it's part of the beginning of a process. But you will also recognise, Chair, that despite the recognition movement, actually what we've seen is further annexation on the West Bank. It has not led to get us getting closer to a process. It's led to further annexation. Now, of course, you can then make the case, regardless, it is time for the United Kingdom to recognise. But I say that the United Kingdom, particularly if you look at the history, our relationship with Balfour, the two communities that were brought together effectively at the birth of the Israeli state, I would prefer it were part of a process. Now, what I outlined to you earlier in terms of the ceasefire might be the beginnings of a process. In fact, and I suspect that our French colleagues are also waiting to see if there is in fact a ceasefire in the next few days, because that would be the beginning of something, particularly if it's a permanent ceasefire and not a pause. So I recognise what you're saying. I have sympathy, in fact, for what you are saying, but these are fine judgments, and this is a live situation, and the crucial thing at the moment are the IDS still going to be there? Is the aid mechanism going to be reasonable? What is the governance arrangements of the new Gaza? How does that link back to the West Bank? And of course, you will recognise also that I think the United Kingdom is playing a greater role than any other partner in terms of our support to PM Mustafa, to Abbas, to the Palestinian Authority, the reforms that are required, to put them in the strongest possible position for when that day comes.
If there was to be recognition, this will be my last question, and then I'll let Umar ask a question. But if there was to be recognition at this stage, or at some stage in the near future, this year, would it not also underline for the Israeli people just how far Netanyahu has moved them as a country away from public opinion in the world?
I think as the country's chief diplomat, I've got to leave issues for the Israeli people, probably, and not stray into that area.
Okay.
Although you're tempting me.
Umar.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. You've set out extensively about your take on recognition, but I want to press you a bit further. You said earlier this year that UK bilateral recognition is the single most important action that the United Kingdom can take with regard to Palestinian statehood, which is why it's important to get the timing right. But on this issue of timing, what is the right timing? So you've set out a few things earlier, but we seem to be holding Palestine to a different standard that we hold the rest of the world to. There are several states or several countries around the world who do things that we perhaps don't agree with. There are contentious situations going on in many states in the world. But when it comes to the recognition of Palestine, and what we've said is the inalienable right of the Palestinian people, we put several markers down on timings, or there's always, what the public may say, is always an excuse for why the timing isn't right. If there were 3 tests, what are the 3 tests for the timing to be right?
Again, I've got to step back because this is not a binary question. This committee, when I was last here, were concerned about the humanitarian catastrophe in Israel, the aid situation in Israel, and the committee has historically been concerned about the funding of UNRWA. I restored that. This committee has been concerned about arms sales to Israel, and I took the sober decision back in September of suspending arms sales to Israel that could be used in Gaza. This committee has rightly been concerned about the Palestinian Authority, the support we give them. I've explained that we are the biggest bilateral supporter of the Palestinian Authority. I hosted Prime Minister Mustafa. He signed a memorandum of understanding with our government. He sat with the Prime Minister in Whitehall just a few weeks ago. This, you will have seen most recently, that I have sanctioned those who commit settler violence. I have sanctioned Ben Gvir and Smodrik for their extremist statements within the government. The list goes on. So that's what I've done in office.
Can I just
hang
say...
on a minute. No. Let me finish
I just want to make it clear. We absolutely appreciate what you've done, but it is our job to continue to push you and never to be satisfied. That's what we do.
Precisely. So on the question you raise around recognition, I'm not going to set a time frame because I've explained that this is a moving, live situation. There are delicate ceasefire negotiations underway. I've explained the issues that sit within that and whether we will get a ceasefire. I'm hopeful that we will. And alongside French and Saudi colleagues, we are discussing recognition. But my indication and my instinct is I actually want things to change the situation on the ground. I don't think I and the committee disagree with that, but there will be a judgment call, and I'm not going to tie myself to a calendar because it's convenient for a soundbite. There's a judgment call that quite properly you would expect the government to think very hard about.
Sorry, go on.
Right. Foreign Secretary, I understand what you set out, and for many people this isn't a soundbite, this is their life and their future, and these are the things that people are caring about, so that's why I'm pressing you on the timescales. When you spoke to us in November, you said that your hope was that Israel would secure a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, and as part of that normalization deal, there's a pathway to a Palestinian state with a 2-state solution. Is normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel a prerequisite for the UK to recognise the state of Palestine?
I'd want to make absolutely clear, crystal clear to this committee, that no country has a veto over when we recognise. I want to be absolutely clear about that, and there are some who've expressed concern that Israel has some sort of veto. They do not. From my conversations with the Saudis and the Saudi Foreign Minister, normalisation is going to be impossible to achieve until there's a ceasefire. And normalisation is going to be impossible to achieve unless there is a tangible progress on 2 states. And I commend, frankly, my Saudi counterparts for holding true to that. And that's why I was speaking to the Saudis as recently as earlier on this week.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. My last question to you. So in the last 24 hours, we've heard reports that the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, where at least 700 Palestinians have been shot whilst waiting for food. There are further plans to expand on that, where the Israeli Defense Minister now plans to move 600,000 Palestinians to a camp in the ruins of the city of Rafah. That's just the first phase. Eventually wants to move the whole of the population of Gaza there. They're calling it a so-called humanitarian transit area, but there's no schools there, there's no medical provisions there, there are no any other facilities, and there are plans for forced screening. Now, CATS wants international partners to be involved in that. Will Britain oppose this, and can you guarantee us in this committee that no British companies or NGOs will be involved in those plans?
Well, we've been very clear that we don't support the aid foundation that has been set up. It's not doing a good job. Too many people are close to starvation. Too many people have lost their lives. We have led globally on our condemnation of the system that has been set up. What we do support are the work of organisations like the World Food Programme, who can play an important role. My understanding is actually over the last few days and weeks there have been better conversations between the UN agency system and Israel. So I'm surprised at the statements that I've seen from Mr. Katz over the last 24 hours, and as I've indicated, they run contra to the proximity to a ceasefire that I thought we were heading towards. So I wonder if there's some politicking going on for those within the government that for some reason standing opposed to this. But what you've described I don't recognise as a serious context in which the people of Gaza can get the aid and support that they need at this time.
Britain will be opposing any such.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm going to move to Abdesam. We have a lot of questions. If it's possible to perhaps
I'll do my best, but these are complex
I know,
issues
of course
that
they
I'm
are. No,
reluctant
of course
to.
they are. And you want to make sure that you express yourself as accurately as possible, and we quite understand that. And you're absolutely on the record, but we've just saying we've got lots of questions.
I know, I do understand. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, if I may just take us back to the question of recognition. You said that no country has the right to veto recognition, including Israel, but they voted in the Knesset against recognition, and we've heard from Israeli representatives. The leader of the opposition said it would take several election life cycles before recognition would take place. Are we just throwing recognition completely into the long grass? Because it does sound like Israel does have a veto here.
Well, Ms. Mohammed, I recognise why you asked this question, but it sort of goes back to what I said before. If you believe that recognition is a symbolic act, that is a sort of reassertion, an unequivocal reassertion of two states, then of course countries like the United Kingdom can make that decision whenever they want, and you might well want that to be tomorrow. What I'm sort of indicating is, despite that movement and despite countries very recently making that decision, actually on the ground we're getting both statements within Israel, and we're getting terrible behaviour around expansion and violence in the West Bank, that notwithstanding recognition is actually the things on the ground are getting worse. Mm-hmm. So all I am proffering to the committee, I say all I'm proffering as if it's sort of I'm praying for and wanting, is actually the situation on the ground to get better. So can the United Kingdom recognise in such a way, at such a moment, that shifting the dial against expansion, against violence, against the horrors that we're seeing in Gaza, and towards the just cause that is the desire for Palestinian statehood, and the solemn obligation, I think, that this country has in relation to the foundation of Israel. So that's all I'm indicating. Okay, but I recognise why you're raising the point.
On the point of expansion, so Netanyahu and Trump are meeting this week. We know in their own words that they are wanting to redraw the lines of the Middle East. And last month it was reported that the US is considering recognising limited Israeli sovereignty over parts of the West Bank. And there seems to be a pattern to these announcements, that they are something that's completely undefensible, but then the international community prevaricates on the announcements, and then Israel just goes ahead and does what it likes anyway. Can you give us your word that the UK will not follow the US lead, and that not a single part of the West Bank will form part of new Israeli territory, and it won't be handed to Israel on a deal which flouts international law?
Oh, let me be clear. There have been 22 new settlements approved by the Israeli government in recent weeks, at least 59 illegal outposts established in 2024. That's up from an average of 7 outposts over the last 25 years. Then there are over 14,000 incidents of settler violence in 2024, all of which is flouting the international law, Oslo, and which we condemn.
The UK will not recognise any Palestinian land that is given to Israel if the US decides to do this.
Look, this sits under the auspices, by the way, of the United Nations. So I don't think it's about what unilaterally a country recognises. The UK position on settler expansion and occupation has been clear, crystal clear, under successive governments. That position has not changed. And in fact, the position has hardened, I think, within the UK government over this last period because of what we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Moving on to a different angle. So you'll have seen from the recent court judgment on the F-35 carve-outs that the sensitive and political issues are a matter for the executive, not the courts. I asked the Permanent Secretary this morning about the International Humanitarian Law Committee in the Foreign Office and how legal assessments are made, which perhaps may breach international law. It wasn't clear from the Permanent Secretary's answer whether those assessments are triggered by evidence compilation of civil servants or whether the ministers are involved in this. But the Permanent Secretary did say that it would depend on whether there'd been any material changes and the nature of the incidents. I wonder if you could expand on what you would consider to be a material change in the types of incidents which would result in an assessment of whether international law had been breached and whether the IHL committee would give you that assessment.
I did see your questioning this morning, and I do understand obviously the seriousness that sits behind those questioning. So just to be clear, we came in a year ago in July. I said in opposition that we would do a complete review of this position, and at the first opportunity, when we were returned on September, I announced that we would be suspending arms sales that could be used in Gaza. On a cyclical basis, it's between every 6 weeks to 2 months. That situation is reviewed, and it's a quasi-legal process that does involve government lawyers, as you would expect, making those assessments on IHL. It's actually against the backdrop of our export licensing regime, and the balance, the test is a clear risk, which is actually quite a low bar. It's not a reasonable doubt. A clear risk is a lower legal standard, and when those documents come across my desk on that sort of 6 week to 2 month timetable, I have continued to assess that there is a clear risk of a breach of international humanitarian law, and those arms have continued to be suspended. So I made the judgment in September. That judgment has been reviewed several times since September, and because of my judgment that there is a clear risk of a breach of international humanitarian law, on the basis that I set out for the House in September, there has continued to be a suspension.
Has there been a recent assessment in relation to the indiscriminate killings that we've seen with people queuing up for aid? Has there been a recent assessment in relation to those incidents that we see? Does that qualify as material change?
The assessments that are made are holistic assessments across the whole range of fronts, including, for example, the treatment of detainees. And as I've said, my judgment has continued to be that there is a clear risk, and therefore we have suspended all arms sales that could be used.
More recently, Foreign Secretary, have you had any assessments more recently?
There have been several assessments since September. And so there has been a recent assessment in which I have made that judgment, yes.
So will the people queuing up for aid, does this qualify as the type of, the nature of incidents that you would look at holistically as part of your assessments?
My assessment pertains, of course, to our export licensing regime, and understandably the British public and members of Parliament on their behalf wanting to ensure that we are not contributing to something where there could be a clear risk of a breach of international humanitarian law.
Is it just in relation to licensing, or is it in holistic?
That is the basis on which I'm asked to make a judgment. I recognise that there's also a broader political set of considerations, and indeed there are considerations that other states have brought to international courts around these issues. And of course I'm cognizant of all of that as well. But in terms of my ultimate role here, it is to make a decision that the United Kingdom is not playing any role in relation to that.
Have any assessments been given in the last 3 months in relation to...
There have been assessments in the last 3 months.
But not enough for you to act on those assessments. As in, have they breached international law?
Well, that's a decision for a court. It's not a decision for the government.
But the court said it's a decision for the executive.
Sorry?
The courts in the last, the recent F-35 carve-out case said that any decision in relation to sensitive and political issues are a matter for the executive, not the court.
Forgive me. The court case that you're referring to, the Al-Haq court case, was in relation to arms exports. And they've said that you're quite right, there was a decision for the executive. I've told you that I, as the executive, have made the decision. I made the decision in September. It has not changed.
But no other recent assessments into wider international law.
I think you're then pushing me to go beyond arms exports to make a judgment about Israel's behaviour, and that's where I am gently pushing back and saying that must be a determination for an international court. I cannot act in terms of that broader judgment. I recognise that you have strong views on that, but I'm not here to act as a court. I am here to act in relation to our arms export regime, and the Al-Haq case that largely confirmed the government position is that I have acted correctly and suspended those arms sales, save for the F-35 carve-out.
Thank you.
We've got 3 other people who want to ask questions on Middle East. I'm going to Richard, then Phil, and then Alex.
Thank you, Chair. And Foreign Secretary, staying with arms export licensing for the moment, I take your point about law, but many of our constituents suspect that the British government is not doing all that it can to influence the Israeli government in relation to the war in Gaza. And specifically on the subject of the sale of F-35 parts into the global spares pool. There's no tracking of these parts. So what do you make of the charge that this is a deliberate decision to look the other way in relation to F-35 spare parts?
I don't accept that. I don't accept that. One, because we are not selling arms sales to Israel. We were only 1% of global arms sales to Israel. It's important to remember. So we are having a conversation about 1% of the global arms sales to Israel. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have suspended arms sales to Israel. We have suspended direct arms sales that could be used, by the way, in the F-35. But what we have said, which has just been upheld by UK courts, is that we are not able, in terms of that supply chain, of which we play a role, but that's a global supply chain, we are not going to bring down F-35s in other theatres of conflict. And members of this committee, with respect, might also press me on our obligations to Ukraine. They might also, and other conflicts around the world. That is why I made that decision, and that has been upheld by the courts.
F-35 isn't being used in Ukraine. The F-22 is being used in Ukraine.
But you'll understand that there are partners across our allies in NATO who also are in a defensive posture in relation to Russia. So you may not like the decision, but I stand by the decision, which has just been upheld by the courts.
In a 2016 paper published by RAND, it was suggested that the legal agreement that set up the global spares pool allows participant nations to opt out and establish separate stocks of assets not subject to shared management. Is this something that the British government has explored with allies?
No.
Are you at all concerned that what we have here is the defence procurement tail wagging the foreign policy dog?
That sounds like a soundbite that's just not serious about our national defences. It's my obligation to be serious about our national defences. I am not going to do anything that puts our armed soldiers at risk, but I also meet my obligations under international humanitarian law. There's been a lot of coverage of this. There was a court case. The government won the court case.
Foreign Secretary, there are members of this committee who have served in uniform. And so we do take that point that you don't want to endanger British lives. Staying with procurement, we heard 2 weeks ago the government announced that it was going to procure the F-35A and that it would be seeking to use the F-35A in a nuclear certified role. How much is that announcement affected by or affecting the decision to continue to supply arms to the global spares pool?
I'm not sure that announcement pertains to that question, but I would be happy to ask colleagues in the Ministry of Defence to write to you.
Okay. Sorry, Phil.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, on the topic of export licences for military use, you mentioned the suspension of the 30 licences back in September out of 350 in place at the time. For the record, could you just explain to the committee and to the public what is constituted in those additional 320 licences that is going to Israel or for use by the Israeli Armed Forces, and why the Foreign Office hasn't considered a complete arms embargo?
Well, the first thing is to say that this is not solely a decision for the Foreign Office. It's a decision that we do, obviously, alongside our colleagues in the Department for Business and Trade, who effectively govern the export licensing regime. The second thing, if you are in the weeds of our export licenses to the State of Israel, is it would be wrong to caricature a significant proportion of those export licenses as to the IDF. So there will be chemicals, for example, that might be licensed for use by a university in Israel. There will be IT security software that is going to a security company in Israel. There will be lab equipment. There are armoured body gear that we are licensing for use by journalists or by NGOs in Israel. And there also is a market, I understand, that passes through Israel but's going on to third and fourth states. So whilst I recognise the debate is concentrated, understandably, on military use and scrutinising and checking that there are not, in some sort of side way, British exports that are going for use by the IDF in Gaza, I reassure the committee that that is not happening. But in terms of that 1%, within that figure are many things that are properly licensed because they're poisons, chemicals, armoured kit, IT, other things, but not all of what we export to Israel is being used by the armed services in Israel. Some of it's going to other sorts of organisations.
Thank you, Chair. I want to take us back to the joint statement with France and Canada on the 19th of May. A very welcome statement, great that our allies were on the same position, opposing the expansion of the offensive in Gaza, opposing the aid system that was used there, and opposing also the expansion of settlements. But of course, we've heard from members of the committee and yourself, Foreign Secretary, that in each of those areas, we've gone in the wrong direction. So there's over 700 people killed, queuing for food, 22 new settlements, and of course, the offensive continues. You did take some measures off the back of that statement, and you talked about some of them already. I wonder if you think they had any impact on the Israeli government's behaviour in the direction of the changes that we're hoping to see.
Not sufficient, but I am comfortable that the UK government, of which I've been part, has if you look at all that we've done on UNRWA, on suspending arms sales, on suspending our FTA, on our sanctioning of Ben Gvir and Smoldrik, sanctioning of settlers, on our support for the Palestinian Authority, our memorandum of understanding with Prime Minister Mustafa, the 101 million support we've got to the occupied territories, the 129 million humanitarian support to the Palestinian people and for medical. I am very, very comfortable that you would be hard-pressed to find another G7 partner or another ally across Europe that's doing more than this government has done.
And I think
now, all of us, the truth is, I've sat with foreign ministers in Europe at the Foreign Affairs Council. There is deep frustration with the situation on the ground in Israel. But that is a combined frustration across nearly every foreign service on the planet.
And I agree with you, Foreign Secretary. We have taken a lot of individual actions, and more so than many of our allies. But in other circumstances, when there is no response to sanctions, or indeed the situation gets worse, there is an escalation. So the government can choose to take further action.
Well, that's a paradigm of escalation. We're close, I hope, to a ceasefire, but you can see that that's pretty escalating since September. I don't think you disagree with that.
It is a paradigm of escalation, as you say, but there will be some people that might say a lot of those measures that are taken were symbolic and important, but symbolic. So the trade suspension of talks, I mean, it leaves the existing trade deal that we have with Israel in existence. And there are some that may argue that Israel has broken its human rights obligations underneath that trade deal, and we should be reconsidering the existing trade deal rather than the trade negotiations for a deal that was coming in the future.
I think that there is frustration that the United Kingdom cannot unilaterally act and change the situation on the ground. And I understand that frustration. But you will recognise that the United Kingdom's ability to do that in the context of this conflict and this arena was largely settled during the Suez crisis. We have not had that power since. Between us and France, it was clear that we were no longer the major actor. We were but one actor, and that is what I sought to do.
Final question, Chair, if I may. So if we do not get the ceasefire we're all praying for in the coming weeks.
We have to get the ceasefire.
But if that is not the case, and we see the abomination that you've described in the intolerable continuation of the situation in Gaza, will the government go further to take measures against Israel?
Yes. Yes, we will.
Some of us met the Red Crescent last week, and we were told about a little boy called Ezzedine. He's a 13-year-old. He was a patient in the Red Cross Field Hospital in Rafah, and he was hit by a stray bullet, and he died on Sunday. There's so many different examples of that, and I think many of us understand and appreciate the government's position, which is it's not for politicians to make decisions about where there have been breaches of international law, but for a court. But I think that when we were in Kyiv, we met some people who were collecting evidence for future court cases paid for by the UK. And I wondered if one of the things that the UK is considering is in some way assisting with the collection of evidence for when there must be a reckoning on what has been going on in Gaza and the West Bank.
I'm always clear that it's important not to equate moral equivalence across different theatres, in which, understandably, the international community can be extremely concerned about behaviours on the ground. I feel very privileged, actually in opposition, to have been on the West Bank with NGOs that we support, who are counting, monitoring the expansion that you see there, who are supporting and working with those who experience Bedouins, who experience settler violence, say in Area C. That work is being funded and supported by British taxpayers as we speak. It's gone on for many, many years. And so some of the international architecture that are used by NGOs that we know very well, or by UN monitoring organisations or agency, actually is a result of British work. That work is a lot harder in Gaza because, as you know, there are restrictions on who can be in Gaza, in place in Gaza, getting visas to go into Gaza. There aren't journalists in the way that they're international journalists, that is, in the way that we would like in Gaza. But it is the case that we support the Palestinian Authority, who, of course, are doing all they can to detail some of that work.
And so people should consciously be on the ground knowing that the British are helping individuals who are collecting evidence for future court cases.
I mean, I'm not over the detail of the future court cases, but I do know that we do support NGOs working on the ground in the occupied territories. We have attempted to support organisations working on the ground in Gaza. I've got to say, in the context of Gaza, the situation is so horrendous that the number one issue, I think, is about life and death and food and means of survival against a horrendous medical backdrop. It is less about the questions of accountability that you understandably go to because the situation is so perilous.
I know, but in the context of hearing about this little boy, it's...
Of course. But I know from my visits to the West Bank, I know from sitting with organisations like Red Crescent, and I was with them just a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days ago, I lose track because of the travel, that work is going on as best it can. A lot of it's actually being done from the occupied territories.
Good.
From the West Bank. Sorry.
We want to also ask you some questions about Iran, and Afra's going to lead on it.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. Yes, I wanted to ask you a bit about the recent strikes between Israel and Iran, and of course the US involvement. I think it's probably fair to say that you've acknowledged the importance of Iran's nuclear program being diminished, but have perhaps been a little bit less committal about whether you supported the US's airstrikes as the means to achieve that aim. So just wanted to ask you, if you didn't support those strikes, whether there was, as you see it, a credible, viable alternative course of action which could have put an immediate stop to the nuclear program.
I think, again, one's got to look at the overall context over the last 20 years. Back in 2009, Gordon Brown said and accused the Iranian state of serial deception, because that was the point at which Fordo and all that was in it was revealed to the world. Since then, of course, working particularly as the E3 with Germany and France, but working originally with the Obama administration, we have tried to get Iran to sign up to commitments under the JCPOA, commitments that they've then gone on to breach, and unfortunately the United States withdrew from that arrangement. The recent IEA assessment is that there now is uranium enriched in Iran to 60% enrichment. And as you know, at our own sites at Sellafield or Urenco in Cheshire, you would not see enrichment of much beyond 5% enrichment. So the only purposes to which you could have 60% is that you are intent on making a weapon. Now, we stand absolutely clear that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and we will do all in our capability working with our allies to stop that happening. It is absolutely crystal clear, though, if you have developed the capacity to enrich to 60%, that knowledge is now within your country. And notwithstanding the action that has been taken by Israel and indeed by the United States to degrade what is there in terms of enrichment, in terms of the centrifuges, in terms of the stockpiles, the knowledge still exists. So there still has to be a diplomatic architecture, and that is why I have spent a lot of the last few weeks with allies speaking to the Iranians, meeting with the Iranians, with the Germans and the French in Geneva, in Washington, D.C., speaking to our US counterparts. It's why we're urging Iran to get back into a negotiation with the United States. Yes, action was taken by the United States. The assessment of the effectiveness of that action in detail is still being determined. But it will still be the case, as I say, that the enrichment capability is there, and so that will require a diplomatic solution, of which you would rightly expect the UK to be at the centre of and to play its part. And that is what we will continue to do.
Thank you for that. And as I understand it, there are reports that Iran has now halted cooperation with the IAEA, so effectively blocking international oversight into Iran's nuclear program, which you've rightly been saying is an important part of finding a long-term solution for this. So I just wanted to ask, therefore, what actions the UK is taking given this decision, and specifically your assessment of how quickly snapback sanctions could be implemented to put pressure on Iran.
Well, I think the decision by Iran to suspend cooperation will only lead to greater uncertainty about their nuclear intentions, and it puts into stark violation of non-proliferation. So it makes what is a very serious situation much, much worse. I conveyed that to the Iranian foreign minister about 10 days ago when this was first suggested. I continue to urge the Iranians to get into talks. And let's be clear about what the situation Iran now finds itself in. Iran has lost its air defences, and I suspect that the Israelis, monitoring Iran very closely, are free to act again if they think that they can further degrade Iran's nuclear capability. Notwithstanding Iran's partnership with China and Russia, I have not seen either of those two countries sort of rushing to defend Iran. Indeed, they too are concerned about Iran's nuclear capabilities and their desire. President Trump took a decision. It was a solemn decision. We were aware that, of course, that President Trump was having to make this calculation to seek to degrade their capability. Iran face even more pressure in the coming weeks because the E3 can snap back on our sanctions, which it's not just our sanctions, it's actually a UN mechanism that would impose dramatic sanctions on Iran across nearly every single front in its economy.
And how quickly
so
could we do that?
They have a choice to make. It's a choice for them to make. I'm very clear about the choice that they should make, but I'm also clear that the UK has a decision to make that could lead to far greater pain for the Iranian regime unless they get serious about the international desire to see them step back from their nuclear ambitions at this time.
Thank you. Well, I can hear the strength of your views on that. As you know, obviously, Iran is a destabilising force for the region, but increasingly poses a direct threat to the UK interests, including here at home. And reports suggest that the upcoming Intelligence and Security Committee report will confirm that Iran continues to target dissidents in the UK, conduct hostile cyber operations and direct activities via the IRGC. And so I wanted to get your views, Foreign Secretary, about what steps the UK is taking internationally to minimise the threat to British citizens on UK soil.
It is the case that our intelligence agencies particularly have thwarted attempts by Iran to commit acts within our own country. It is the case that there are Iranians currently before our courts. And it's also the case that it's my assessment that Iran is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism that we're facing in our country at this time. And therefore, for all of those reasons, we have been very clear too, and that's why the Home Secretary asked Sir John Hall to do a review on state threats, that we will be coming forward with further legislation where there are gaps. He did identify gaps because, as it were, state-sponsored terrorism is a sort of newer phenomenon, if you like, than dealing with terrorist cells. And so there is work that we've got to do, but we will do all we can to keep our people safe. And yes, of course, when I speak to the Iranians, I am pretty focused on their nuclear ambitions, thwarting that alongside my partners. But as you would imagine, I have also raised successively with them their state sponsoring of terrorism.
Will we have a clear and comprehensive strategy on Iran?
There is a strategy on Iran. It's a classified strategy because if we published it, it would assist them. But of course there's a strategy on Iran. And you should be confident that both in terms of counter-terrorism, the work that's done at CTOC, the work that's done by the SIS and by MI5, of course there's a strategy on Iran, and that is a subject that you'd expect the National Security Council have discussed, and is a preoccupation of all forms of law enforcement and our agencies across government, security agencies across government.
Blair.
Thanks, Chair. Foreign Secretary, if you glance out the window to the left here, you see the hospital where the mother of Ala Abdel Fattah has been gravely ill in her hunger strike. The loved ones of lots of those who suffer from arbitrary detention will be watching, whether it's her family or Ryan Cornelius or Jimmy Lai, Jagtar Singh Johal. If time allows, I'll ask about specific cases, and I think Sir John might as well. But 6 months ago, you talked to us about the special envoy that you hope to appoint, and about the terms of reference and the mandate that they would have. I wonder if there's been progress and when you might expect to be able to report on progress on both of those.
I did make a commitment in opposition because it was my view that we did need an envoy for these more challenging consular cases. It was important to see in detail how the system works in coming into government. I do want to put on record my thanks to our diplomats, both in Whitehall but also in sites across the world who deal with the 28,000 consular cases every year. Every year there are about 5,000 Brits who die abroad that they are assisting. There are Brits who get caught up in criminal cases abroad who they are assisting. And lots, and you will have seen in the news all sorts of tragic and complex cases that our officials support on. So the overwhelming bulk of that work I want to praise and thank the diplomats that work so hard. But yes, there are these very challenging cases. This year we have had some successes. Peter Hupson just came out of Equatorial Guinea, for example. We put a lot of effort into that case. I am very concerned about Ala Abdel Fattah. I've met with his family, and I have most recently spoken to Layla as she has been in St Thomas's. A lot of work is going on.
In terms of the appointment?
To bring him home. On the appointment, I hope that when I certainly am next before the committee, that appointment will have been made.
Making a note of that.
And I that depends on the chair, but I suppose I'm indicating that I hope we will get there by the end of the year.
Can I ask about the nature of the appointment? When the committee were in Washington, we met with the presidential envoy on hostage affairs, and they were really clear in saying that their effectiveness was in large part down to the very clear mandate that they had, that gave them a sort of quasi-independence within the State Department to pursue their own agenda with regards to hostages. Do you envisage this being something which is internally advertised and appointed internally, or something which is spreading wider so that it does have that personality and that mandate?
Let me give you an indication without entirely. I said that I needed to think very hard about how this worked in coming into the department. You will have seen yesterday that I made a decision around a very sensitive case where I believe that there was tremendous injustice and pain for the family involved, the Harry Dunn case. And there we've asked Dame Annos, someone of huge independence who was a former prisons inspector, very robust, very capable individual, to conduct a lessons learned review for us. I do think it's important that we have the right figure that can command the respect of the families that find themselves in these situations, and I hope of the committee. And so that's why the deliberations of how that work, and you're right to press me on it, is something that does take some judgment, and what's the best architecture and the way to move forward.
As a long-standing friend of Harry Dunn's family, I know that his extraordinary mother would be really grateful to have any help. Amazing woman. I mean, really. Yeah, no, really amazing woman. Good. We're going to move on to Ukraine, I think. Afra, thank you.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, in May I submitted a number of written questions to your department regarding the ODA budget and the potential impact of reductions on UK-supported schemes in Ukraine. Specifically,
what's the ODA budget, you say?
Yeah. Sorry. But specifically in relation to Ukraine, particularly schemes, those addressing sexual violence, healthcare, education, reconstruction. And the department's replies offered really only broad commitments to flexibility and strategic alignment, but gave very little reassurance about the security of specific programme funding. Now that the spending review has concluded, I just wonder whether you can confirm whether any of the UK's ODA commitments to Ukraine are facing reductions or reallocations.
The Prime Minister made a commitment at the time that we made the decision to increase our defence spending, and he made a solemn commitment to Parliament that he would continue to support bilaterally through our ODA our commitments in Ukraine, in the occupied territories, in Sudan, and that commitment stands. And of course there are conflicts like in Syria, where I have been, where you would expect there to be a very important bilateral commitment that we make. So I don't want to preempt we've just got the spending room settlement. We're having to go through detail, and I saw the committee pressing the Perm Sec on to make commitments ahead of the autumn. I can't preempt that, but I do believe that we will end up in a place where our commitments to Ukraine continued, as I suspect Parliament would expect them to, and certainly as I would expect my counterpart in Ukraine would expect them to.
I do appreciate what you've said about Ukraine being a priority that the Prime Minister has set out and you've supported. Obviously, we've kind of gone back and forth and written questions, and I'm asking you now, and there always seems to be another date in the future at which the kind of answer will come. But really, I'm just asking for a commitment about whether there's going to be reductions in spending or not.
Well, there won't be reductions in spending on Ukraine, because across UK commitment on both military and non-military, we've got an 18 billion since the invasion begun. We've dispersed 1.5 billion of our ERA loan. Our commitment to Ukraine is ongoing. We've signed a 100-year partnership with Ukraine. So that happens to be the one area in which I'm pretty clear and confident that there will not be any reductions, not just because of what the Prime Minister says, but we've made commitments alongside our allies to Ukraine in NATO, in the G7, and across the coalition of the willing. Now, in a context in which we're also stepping up on defence spending and our defence obligations to Ukraine, in a context in which in the 100-year partnership there's also technical assistance to Ukraine, some of which will not be ODA. These things are finely balanced over the next 5 to 10 years, but I am very confident that I can make the commitment that we're stepping back, and I don't expect that Ukraine will be making representations to us about less commitment. I suspect more that they'll be asking us to encourage others to play their role as well.
Thank
Do
you.
you have many other questions, Afra? Because I'm starting to get concerned about the time.
That's 2 quick questions.
There's 2 quick questions. Could we have 2 quick answers?
Yeah, very, very quickly. We visited Ukraine earlier this year, and following that, I met with one of the legal advisors and senior lead teams within the Ukraine's conflict-related sexual violence mobile justice team, and she raised serious concerns about the scale of conflict-related sexual violence and the limited capacity of the Ukrainian system to respond effectively given the sheer scale. I just wondered whether there was specific support the FCDO was providing to strengthen Ukraine's ability to investigate and prosecute these crimes, and whether you would agree that meaningful accountability must ultimately include prosecutions at the highest levels within Russia.
Yes, I do. I've sat with victims of sexual violence in Ukraine. The committee will know I take a particular interest in children and vulnerable children, often who don't have parents, and we're funding that work. We're also funding work, as the chair indicated, on accountability and a monitoring and the legal work that goes into understanding where those crimes have been committed. That is ongoing work of which we play our part. We also, by the way, fund some of the work that's being undertaken by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So yes, you have that commitment.
Thank you. And just in relation to that, you talked about the some of the issues with children. Of course, there's the horrific abduction of children from Ukraine. I hear what you're saying about supporting funding for some of those organisations. I understand that the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, who undertake some of the work to help track down those children, have had their funding removed from the US, and they've been seeking funding from other sources. Have they approached the FCDO, and is that something you might be prepared to commit funding to?
I know that we're an active member of the International Coalition for the Return of Ukrainian Children, and obviously I have a personal commitment and work that we're doing alongside Madam Zelensky in this area. I will write to you on that particular stream, if I may.
Thank you.
Right, I've got Dan and Richard, Edward and Phil all want to ask questions about Ukraine. So can I start with you, Dan?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Foreign Secretary. To what extent is the UK now leading on Ukraine? Obviously, the role of the United States has changed over recent months, and I just wondered if you could update the committee on what the UK role, how you see the UK's role now, and where is the coalition of the willing currently?
Well, I applaud President Trump's efforts to try and bring this war to an end, to try and get a ceasefire, and I roundly condemn President Putin's obfuscation and maximalist demands that have not led to that ceasefire. President Trump was very clear that it was unlikely that another supplement would pass through through Capitol Hill for further military funding for Ukraine, and right from the beginning of his time in office has called for the other allies, particularly across the NATO family, to step up. And you will have seen the very successful summit in NATO, at NATO in The Hague, where those commitments were made to step up. At the same time, again, I think after a very difficult meeting, I think, between President Trump and President Zelensky, I was hugely proud of our Prime Minister, and I think you saw the strength of the relationship, that the first place that President Zelensky came to was number 10, and that embrace outside number 10, I think, also calmed the nerves of the global community, frankly. And the coalition of the willing was born out of that. And the coalition of the willing was effectively an attempt with UK and French leadership, and I also commend the work of France in this area, was an attempt to go not at the pace of the slowest, but the pace of the fastest in terms of our support for Ukraine, and absolutely also that support in the event that we got that ceasefire. Now, when that work began, we hoped for a ceasefire. We still hope for a ceasefire, but our assessment is that Putin is not yet ready to make the compromises necessary to get that enduring ceasefire. So good work has gone in. Now, a lot of that work is across chiefs of defence staff and across ministries of defence, across the sort of Western alliance of countries who stand in support of Ukraine. And we have played a very important leadership role and will continue to play a very important leadership role. It's one particularly that our Baltic colleagues are very grateful for.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary. It is sickening to think that Putin has sent 1 million of his own young people to their deaths in this conflict. Can I ask you specifically on the issue of long-range missiles, what your view is of whether they are part of, if the supply of those to Ukraine would aid or hinder achieving a peace?
Well, just to say that obviously the last period has been intense. Russia's launched over 20,000 drones at Ukraine, 2,500 just in April alone. They've also crossed the 1 million mark in terms of their own casualties, but the toll in Ukraine over the last few weeks has been significant. And in the last 6 months, the numbers of ballistic missiles Russia's deployed has risen from 20 to 25 per month to 43 in June. So your question around missiles is important. At this time, the Ukrainians are raising questions around Patriot missiles particularly, that they believe that they are in need of. Not all of that capability actually is in the stockpile of the United Kingdom, as you will understand, but we are speaking to other allies on these issues. It wouldn't be right for me to comment on operational issues, so I won't go there, but we are playing our role.
One quick final question from me. I presume other colleagues will ask about sanctions.
Yes.
I just wondered whether you thought it would be time for our Prime Minister maybe to engage in direct diplomacy with President Putin.
That must probably be a decision for the Prime Minister, but I think our diplomacy in this area is a tribute to this country. This has remained a cross-party issue, so I also pay tribute to my predecessors in terms of their leadership on Ukraine. Successive Prime Ministers have not determined it's of any benefit at all to speak to Vladimir Putin at a time when he's clearly desiring a sort of imperialist ambitions and tremendous aggression that's costing lives. And by the way, he too, there is evidence too of aspect of state-sponsored terrorism. We've had poisonings on our own soil, so it's not been the determination of successive prime ministers that this would benefit. Now that could change, he could have a different posture, but that has been the assessment and I don't see that changing at this moment.
Thank you.
I want to go to Richard, but then we are really getting quite short of time, and I think we're going to have about 10 minutes to ask you about sanctions, with 3 different people wanting to ask you questions. So if it's possible to have shorter questions and possibly shorter answers, I'd appreciate it.
Certainly.
Richard.
I have only one question, Chair. First, I must correct the record that it's the F-16 which is being used in Ukraine, not the F-22. I'd like to ask about contingency planning for the US withdrawing what remains of its supply to Ukraine. Can you tell us about discussions that you've had with the UK's allies in Europe around filling gaps that emerge from US disengagement?
Yes.
I do want to just emphasise that in terms of intelligence sharing and deep cooperation on military lines, I don't want to, I think US disengagement is a strong word. What I see is the US still playing a considerable part in this conflict, although it is clear that in terms of their obligations in the Indo-Pacific particularly, and other theatres of conflict at this time. They've been asking Europe to do more. And yes, in part because this position was well understood before Donald Trump came to power, but then the conversation is accelerated whilst in power. In many ways, the Coalition of the Willing has been a very good forum in which we have been in that deep discussion. So there are capabilities that it would be problematic if the Americans were to withdraw from. But in terms of Europe and allies beyond that, Canada, particularly others playing their part, Australia and Japan, South Korea playing their part, I'm confident that we can continue to support Ukraine, to keep Ukraine in the fight. But I would want to emphasise, I suspect the committee will return to this in their questions, I'd want to emphasise that we also believe that it's the economic might of those combined allies that actually can bring Putin to look at these things seriously. And if you look at inflation in Russia, if you look at the oil price, if you look at military losses, in the end it's that might bring Putin to his senses.
Yes, I think we do have some questions about that, and we've got Edward.
Thank you, Chair. To that point, the committee was in Washington fairly recently, and almost to a T, conversations with Republicans on the Hill was that there would be no further military assistance, and the best Ukraine could hope for would be more sanctions on Russia. Senators Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, who have brought forward the sanctions Russian asset bill, there is concern, as I understand it, amongst the UK and European allies about secondary sanctions within their falling foul of potential 500% tariffs, which could happen by accident. How is the UK engaging with the US administration to make sure that anything the US does is supportive of Ukraine but not penalising those other countries that are also trying to support Ukraine?
Well, I thought it was very good for Secretary of State Rubio to bring Lindsey Graham to the informal foreign ministers meeting at NATO in Turkey, so that we could have that discussion with Senator Graham. And of course, our embassy, led by Peter Mandelson, is making the necessary representations, and making those representations at this stage not so much, I think, in the White House. I think it is understood in the White House, but on Capitol Hill. All indications are that bill has now, I think, is just in the last week, I think, has been on the Senate floor. And we suspect that it will be subject to amendment because there has been concern about the secondary sanctions and its effect on allies and partners in the global economy.
If I may just have one more. A lot of the conversations that I felt like I was having on the Hill was with senators and Congress people who were echoing the President's line that Ukraine must settle and must accept loss of territory. To what extent do you agree that that must be the cost of peace, or do you believe that we must return Ukraine to its full sovereign integrity?
My experience speaking to senators like Senator Risch, Senator Warner, Senator Graham, as well as Democratic senators like Senator Murphy, Senator Shaheen, and then in Congress.
Please don't list anymore, because we really are running out of time. Lots of congressmen.
There is a range of opinion, I think, that exists on the Hill. I think there is support for Ukraine. Of course, at some point there will be a settlement. All conflicts end with a settlement. But what we are doing is supporting Ukraine to stay in the fight. They're the ones suffering civilian losses. They're the ones dealing with this act of aggression and bombing of their energy supplies and other things at this time. We are supporting them, and we are ratcheting up economic pressures. The EU will have, I think, an 18th sanctions package very shortly. I was hoping it would land yesterday, but I suspect it will land in the next couple of days. We have continued, as you know, the UK has sanctioned more individuals in this area than any other nation. So we continue with that pressure and the leadership that you would expect the UK to play.
To the core of my question, is it your view that Ukraine must accept loss of territory in order to achieve a peace?
That must rightly be an issue for President Zelensky and for the Ukrainian people, not for the UK to determine. This is his peace, that he must determine. What we do is work to support him in his fight. And I remember being with President Zelensky where they commemorated the invasion of Crimea, standing with him on that territory that he would like to see returned.
Foreign Secretary, you talked about keeping Ukraine in the fight. To what extent have you made progress in securing the £2.5 billion proceeds of the sale of Chelsea Football Club and being able to use that to help Ukraine?
Well, I regret that we have not been able to deploy those funds as I would have wished. And we have indicated that we will go to the courts on this issue, because we are determined that that money is deployed for the means that Parliament and the government at the time settled that they should be used for.
And taking a wider view, there's the €300 billion of Russian state assets that is currently held in the West, including substantial assets in Euroclear in Belgium. What progress have you made with allies across the West in being able to confiscate and seize those assets to keep Ukraine in the fight and to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine?
Well, you're right. It's crucial that both European Union and G7 partners tackle the issue of Russian sovereign assets. We have got to accept that 90% of those assets are held outside of the UK, and where there are countries within Europe that feel vulnerable, it's important that we come together and we can act, if you like, as a coalition as we make assessments about how to deploy those sovereign assets. We have sent technical teams of lawyers, of economists, particularly to those countries, and offered that to help them to better understand what we think could be part of the architecture to deliver that. Different systems do have different legal assessments of their vulnerability, different economic assessments, understandably, of their vulnerability. We're not going to be able to act unilaterally, and neither of these countries are going to be able to act unilaterally. We have to come to a shared view. The European Union has been pretty focused on their most recent sanctions package, and you will recognise that there are countries within the European Union that have held up some of that discussion, but I think that they're settling on that, and I'm hoping that it can turn its mind in a bigger way to the issue of sovereign assets over this next period. But I do have to be sensitive that it is not the United Kingdom that's most exposed, it is other countries, and some of those countries are particularly small.
Good, thank you. We want to move on and talk about soft power. John.
Foreign Secretary, I explored with the Permanent Secretary before lunch the consequences of the need to find savings in the Foreign Office budget, and particularly in ODA expenditure, on two major elements of the soft power programme in this country, the BBC World Service and the British Council. Both are terrific assets and are doing an extremely important job in the face of increasing tide of disinformation from authoritarian states like China and Russia. Should we not be looking to increase our commitment to those organisations rather than looking at how we can save money by cutting their budget?
Well, in simple terms, I commend the work of both the BBC World Service and the British Council. They are both stellar institutions and organisations. I've seen their work over the 25 years I've been in public life. It's tremendous work. And most recently, I saw British Council work in Morocco that's outstanding. And I've seen great work also in India in this year that I've been in office. On the BBC World Service, I think it's important to remember that actually in my period I increased by, I think it was 31%, the money available to the BBC World Service. That shows my commitment. I don't think any other part of the Foreign Office got quite that upgrade in their finances. And in terms of the British Council, we give them between, I think, 15 and 16% of their overall funding. So the lion's share of their funding does come from sort of revenue raising.
Foreign Secretary, you'll be aware that the British Council
do.
have said that they are going to have to close possibly 36 offices unless they get an uplift. Now, those will include places like the offices in at least one, if not more, of the Baltic states, which are strategically of vital importance. How can you say that we are going to continue to influence and project British values at the time when the organisations that are best placed to do that are looking at these budget reductions?
Well, the British Council is in the midst of transformation, have not yet come to me with their transformation plan.
But would you accept the closure of 36 offices if that is what they say?
Can I finish the point? Because it's a serious question and I want to make. So they have been losing money in the last few years. I think it's about 50 million a year that they have been losing. You'll understand that particularly around English language teaching, there are other actors in the marketplace and some of the areas that they work. So they understandably want to get back to a good business model and they will come forward to me with that. I have seen in the speculation about the closure of offices that decision has not been made either by them, has not come to me. They have around a presence in about 100 offices across the globe. They have closed offices in the past, but not on the order that I'm hearing. But I have to wait for them. In the end, they're an independent agency. I have to wait for them to come forward to me with our plans. We give them grant and aid. It's less than a quarter of their overall budget. So you'll understand that they hit tough times during the pandemic. Some of the problems, I think, have come as a consequence of the pandemic and changing in models. They are doing that work. They will then come to me. And we will make, I will hear where they have got to on their plans.
Can I make a suggestion to you? Because we are all committed to the overall increase in defence expenditure, and I raised this with the Permanent Secretary. And yet, actually, we are facing aggressive activity on behalf of China and Russia, and you can make the case that actually the BBC World Service and the British Council are doing more for the overall defence of our country than spending a tiny bit more on an aeroplane. And the money we're talking about is relatively small in comparison to the overall defence budget. Can you not make the case to the Treasury that this should be included in part of the overall uplift in defence expenditure?
In terms of the sentiment of the question, I'm not sure I'm in disagreement. And actually, if you look at what's happened, for the BBC World Service, they had an uplift of 31%, which I made. And for the British Council, they also had an uplift of taxpayers' money, if you include the loan that they got that was taxpayers' money. Both organisations have had taxpayers make a big contribution to them as institutions. However, the British Council has got to make a determination about the direction of travel and transformation to get back into health. They rightly then have to present that to me, and then we can come to sort of shared decisions, recognising that we play a relatively small role in direct aid and grant to that organisation, and have done over actually many, many years. I think it's not been that different when we were last in power, certainly when the Labour Party was last in power. So they must determine the model. They will then come back to me. It's got to be something that puts them on a good footing and is a business model that can survive. And all organisations, however much we adore them, have got to be fit for purpose for the 21st century. And I think that's what they're trying to work out over this next period.
Well, I'm gratified that both you and the Permanent Secretary said that you agreed, at least in part, with the principle. Yes. Can I move on quickly to media freedom?
Before you do, I mean, you've talked about wanting to get the British Council back to health. Do you think that of course the World Service is in a much better state than it would have been if it hadn't had the increase in its budget. But do you believe that it's back to health? Do you believe that it's in a healthy state? I mean, we spend 400 million on the World Service, whereas China and Russia together are spending 8 billion a year. It seems like a bit of an unfair fight.
It's reaching about 320 million people, the BBC World Service. That's outstanding. And it plays an important role. But obviously on behalf of the British taxpayer, I understandably have to be insistent about value for money, however sympathetic I am to the organisation. And so those are judgments that we have to make. But I think it was right for me to seek extra funds from the Treasury and to win those funds to the BBC World Service last year.
Just moving quickly to media freedom, Blair McDougall raised a specific case of Ala Abdel Fattah. Now, you've expressed strong support, strong words, but you said 4 years ago, what diplomatic price has Egypt paid? And I think I can put the same question to you now. It's fine to make fine words, but he is still in prison, his mother is still on hunger strike, and there is no sign of his being released. So what more will the British government do?
We are in intense discussion with our Egyptian friends. This issue has been raised and is being discussed at every single level. The Prime Minister, President Sisi, Jonathan Powell as NSA and his equivalent, myself and the Foreign Secretary. Those discussions are ongoing, and I hope to bring him home.
Okay. Can I just draw your attention to another concern which has been raised, which is it has just been announced the closure of the Afghan Citizens Relocation Scheme. It was intended to bring journalists out under that scheme in the later phase. It appears that that has now been dropped. That is going to potentially put at risk some brave people. Is that something you will also look at again?
Of course, alongside, that is to some extent led by our colleagues in the Ministry of Defence alongside the Home Office, but of course we will play our role.
And can I put one last question to you, which I hope you might welcome and certainly think about? The UK founded the Media Freedom Coalition in 2019. It is something where we have taken a lead throughout, but today the need for media freedom is probably greater than it's been at any previous time. As you may know, the chair is on a rotating basis of 2 countries at a time. Will you consider for the UK and yourself to take the chair in forthcoming change?
I'm happy to look at it.
Wonderful. Good. Edward, I think you want to talk about China.
I did. Thank you, Chair. We spent some time talking about the China audit with the Permanent Secretary earlier. The other week, Foreign Secretary, you presented the National Security Strategy to Parliament. In that document, it said instances of China's espionage, interference in our democracy, and the undermining of our economic security has increased in recent years. You talked earlier about the threat of Iran, you've talked about the threat of Russia. Is the government prioritising trade with China above adding China to the enhanced tier of foreign influence registration scheme?
Well, what we did was a comprehensive audit of our relations with China. I would refer you to the Strategic Defence Review. I would refer you to the National Security Strategy, where it's pretty clear our concerns. I have said in terms in Parliament, the sanctionings of our parliamentarians is unacceptable. The espionage that's undertaken in our country is unacceptable. We've allocated an extra 600 million to our security agencies to assist them because of our concerns. So I think it would be a caricature to suggest that this is all about trade. It isn't about trade. It's about a complex relationship with a global superpower on many different levels.
Does it not meet the criteria? Do their actions not meet the criteria for being added to the enhanced tier of first?
Those determinations, quite properly, are made across government, and I'm not going to anticipate that determination today. That would be quite wrong. But I think what I set out to Parliament was a comprehensive audit, and understandably, a significant part of that audit is classified, and understandably, it's the Intelligence Committee that is able to explore and look at those issues in detail.
Can I explore a little bit further the classified nature of the China audit, which we spoke about with the Permanent Secretary earlier on? I think the concern with the conversation earlier on was not just that the audit itself was classified, but that the strategy coming out of the audit is also classified. And it was clear from your statement how wide-ranging the government views some of the challenges from China are. And given we need local authorities, academia, people in the science and technology sectors, and also communities like the Hong Kong community in my constituency, to know what they should be doing in response to this China audit. How does one operationalise something which is not only the analysis, but the plan coming out of the analysis is secret?
Our position is consistent with our Five Eyes partners, who have been, when determining their own strategies of China, in a similar place in terms of what they have felt they should make public and what they should understandably not. And I have to be sort of clear about that. But I do think across both our industrial strategy, our strategic defence review, our national security strategy, and the statement that I have given to the House, there is clearly a direction of travel and a certainty on our position. I summarise that as, we will cooperate with China where we can, and we will challenge China where we must. I've talked about the 3 Cs. I've talked about extra funds and capability that I think we have to invest in at this time. I'm confident that we have the right architecture now across government to move forward with a comprehensive approach to China that won't see the government bouncing around from pillar to post, which is what we saw under the last 14 years. And that is why I wanted to do the audit, and that is what I've completed. I do recognise that this committee is a little frustrated because it would like to see some of that classified work.
Do our job.
I can undertake. What I would say, obviously in terms of our system, the Intelligence Committee is capable of doing that work, and there are privy councillors on this committee who could see more should they seek and ask the government to assist them with more. But that is the nature of our system.
My concern is less about whether we get to see the kind of sexy secret stuff. It's more about, again, the breadth of how this relationship with China is going to impact on every part of society in the coming years. Germany published its China strategy. Will there be anything coming out of this China audit process which is publicly available so that all of those different sectors, all those different communities I mentioned are able to be informed in some way with it? I completely agree with you about the importance of protecting Five Eyes and the intelligence that's behind it. But in terms of the behaviours that we need people to pursue in response to the threats identified within the audit.
Well, we've said that there will be a new China hub and guidance for business particularly, where we were working with them. I'm keen to continue discussion with with colleagues in the Department for Education on the further support that we should give to universities at this time as a result of the China audit. And you've heard the PermSec talk about capabilities across government, including in Mandarin speaking, which the chair focused on in her questioning to both the PermSec and myself today, which I hope reassure the committee that we're taking these issues seriously. So if there are streams of work that flow from the audit that build on the Strategic Defence Review, the Industrial Strategy and the National Security Review, that of course are public and will be public over the coming months and years.
Just finally, Chair, if I can bring together my earlier question with this question, on Jimmy Lai, still detained under incredibly dubious legal circumstances, denied consular access, advancing years and in ill health. The United States sanctioned the individuals who are responsible for that in 2020. I just wonder at what point, I know you are working hard, but, particularly in sort of gentle behind the scenes diplomacy, but at what point do we follow the lead of the United States and take tougher action to the people who are responsible for the crackdown on human rights abuses generally in Hong Kong, but on Mr. Lai in particular?
We remain really concerned about Jimmy Lai. We've been clear that we believe that the prosecution is politically motivated. We've made those representations to China at every single level, and I certainly have to Foreign Minister Wang Li when I've met him on numerous occasions, and I expect to see him again shortly, and I will make those representations once more. Putting a 77-year-old man through a 52-day testimony was hardship indeed. I think that we're expecting the case effectively, or closing arguments effectively, to be on the 14th of August, and then to get a judgment in October, November of this year. And as you would expect, we are coordinating closely with the United States and the Trump administration, who have taken a big interest in the injustice facing Jimmy Lai, and we will continue to press this with the Chinese. I think it would be a catastrophe, frankly, a huge mistake for China and its global reputation if it were to find itself in a situation where a 77-year-old man who is clearly, as you would expect at that age, in the twilight of his life, were to die in custody. And I've made that very clear to them.
For exercising rights that the Chinese signed up to guarantee.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I just ask you one more question on China, because I did say that we'd come back to it, which was how many China fast streamers is the Foreign Office going to be recruiting, and when are we going to see the first cohort?
I asked the PermSec to write to you on that.
Yeah, no, that's good, thank you. So now we have 3 questions and we have 8 minutes. So, just so everybody knows. So I'm going to start with Uma on Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, when you last appeared before the committee in November 24, I asked you about justice for the Tamil community. I want to start by saying how grateful I am to you for your personal commitment to this and the support you've shown the Tamil community for over a decade. You know my family's story in relation to this. Really pleased that in March the UK finally introduced sanctions against those responsible for serious human rights violations, abuses during the armed conflict, including extrajudicial killings, torture and sexual violence. It was a hugely important moment for the community. But sadly, in the past month, there's been a horrific discovery of another mass grave in Chemani, the northern province in Sri Lanka. It includes the discovery of bodies of 3 babies. And it's a real fresh reminder of how close to home these atrocities are. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has voiced concerns that there aren't sufficient resources in Sri Lanka to conduct exhumations of newly discovered mass graves in line with international standards. Has the government raised this? Has the UK government raised this with officials in Sri Lanka? And is the UK providing any support to ensure that the exhumations are conducted properly? And I know our minister was there recently.
Well, look, let me say that I've got very grave concerns in relation to the mass grave that has recently been discovered at Chemini. That yes, we have raised it with the Sri Lankan government directly. We did that last month. Yes, we are in close touch with families of those who've disappeared from across the country, and we're working with voices, with NGOs and others to make sure that their voices are heard. I am happy to look at whether there is technical expertise we can bring to bear supporting those, looking at the mass grave issue, understanding that there are capacity issues within the country. So I am prepared to look at that and will do.
Thank you. Can I just ask, again, really short, it's a yes or no, whether you'd consider the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights recommendation that the perpetrators of atrocities are referred to the International Criminal Court?
My understanding is that Sri Lanka is not an ICC state party, so the court wouldn't have jurisdiction to investigate any crimes that might be committed. So that is the difficulty in what you recommend.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes and 2 questions. Phil.
Foreign Secretary, you've long campaigned for London to be the anti-corruption capital of the world, and may I commend you for those efforts. At that context, I want to talk very briefly about the overseas territories via Georgia. And in Georgia, leading members of the Georgian Dream Party, the pro-Russian Georgian Dream Party, have, whilst crushing civil society and cracking down on Georgian people's civil liberties, allegedly used British Virgin Islands registered companies to secrete and hide their wealth behind a veil of financial secrecy. At the same time, the British Virgin Islands has missed, yet again, another deadline to introduce publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership, following on from the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act that was passed in this place in 2018. And they missed the deadline in 2020 and in 2023. What message do you think that sends to the world at large?
It's a terrible message, and it's one that we continue to discuss with the British Virgin Islands, and we are serious, and that is why I will be having a conference later on next year on illicit finance. It's why I ask Dame Margaret Hodge to support us in our efforts to grip this issue and rally the international community. So there's more to come from the department. I'm not on the detail of the case that you raise with Georgia and corrupt activity there, but I will look at it closely, and we will make those representations to the British Virgin Islands.
Alex, last question.
Thank you. Thank you, Foreign Secretary, for being so patient. So during your Mansion House speech, you announced a new counter-hybrid task force that will focus on a new age of sabotage and subterfuge, where technology is power. I appreciate in this setting you won't be able to tell us too much about that, but if you could expand a little bit on what that might be doing. The committee has a strong interest in this with our disinformation inquiry.
Well, I encourage the committee and applaud the committee for taking an interest in the activity of a number of autocracies at this point in time, in their cyber warfare that they're engaged in. Obviously, the country under the last government did invest in our national cyber capabilities and certainly in supporting the work of our security services, particularly in GCHQ in this regard. But there's more that we can do to coordinate at this time, working with allies. I saw excellent work when I was in Moldova on the support we're giving Moldova at this time in this area. There are a number of countries saying we'd like British expertise. So I don't want us just to deploy that to defend ourselves. I want us to be able to deploy that expertise with partners where appropriate. So that's a starting point for what I announced in Mansion House. There's a lot of activity that has to underpin that, and there are other government departments that we need to work with, particularly the work that Peter Carl's doing to make this really effective.
Thank you. That concludes the session. We got through all the questions. With a minute to go.
Thank you very much. Look forward to coming again.
Oh, no. And thank you very much for coming. And we do appreciate it. This concludes the session. Order.